huge welcome to all of you for joining us for the fully digested budget breakfast. I'm Melanie Leech, I'm Chief Executive of the BPF for those who don't know me, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel. I have, in no particular order, going around my screen, Anita Boateng, Senior Director at FTI, Andrew Carter, Chief Executive of Centre for Cities, Adam Challis, Head of EMEA Living and Research and Strategy at JLL, David Gork here, I think this morning in his capacity as Head of Public Policy at Macfarlane's, but wearing so many other hats from previous lives that'll be hugely relevant and interesting to hear about this morning. And Lindsay Judge, the Research Director at the Resolution Foundation. Welcome to all of my panel too. We really, all of us, want it to be an interactive event. My panelists, I know, have got loads of things to talk about and to tell you about and their views on the budget, but we'd love to hear from you too. So please do use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and I'll weave as many of your questions as I can into the conversation as we go along. So without further ado then, let's talk about the budget, and let's start with the big picture and the political overview of it. David and Anita, I'm going to come to both of you first, perhaps David first of all. What were the key political messages from the budget? You know, was this a political budget or a budget of policy? And did the Chancellor get the balance right between, you know, the support that needs to continue and the long-term plan for getting back to some kind of fiscal stability and normality, you know? And was this a Tory budget at all?
Well, I think it's certainly, politics certainly drove this budget in the sense that there were clearly economic objectives there, but politics weighed pretty heavily. The most important thing to do economically was to provide continued support to the economy as we come out of the pandemic and the lockdown, and he did that, continuation of a lot of the temporary support. There's also an issue ultimately in the mind of the Chancellor that the public finances have to be put on a sustainable footing. Now, in truth, I think on economic grounds, he didn't need to address that in this budget, but this budget politically was his best chance to do so, because he's got some cover, you know, he's giving lots of stuff away. It's perhaps easier to do things sometime in advance. So he then did the fiscal stabilization bit, if you like, by announcing the tax increases. And because of quite skilled pitch rolling, if you like, I think that's landed reasonably well. I personally think the corporation tax rate increases are a mistake for our long-term productivity. But I think in terms of being able to land some big tax increases, which I suspect he will legislate for in the next finance bill, he's managed to do that. So he's been quite clever politically, and I think addressed what he sees as a long-term political risk, which is debt growing even after we come out of the lockdown and the pandemic and so on. It's not about repaying the debt, it's just about stabilizing it as a proportion of GDP. And Melanie, you ask, is it a conservative budget? The truth is that conservative governments have increased taxes plenty of times before. So you can look at the Norman Lamont's budget of 1993. You can look at what Geoffrey Howe did in 1979. It is not that unconservative to increase taxes, because there's quite a strong fiscally conservative element to the Conservative Party traditions, but it is definitely a departure from the approach taken in really since Nigel Lawson of broad-based low rates, bringing corporation tax down. I mean, this is the first increase since Dennis Healey in 1974, I confess I'm trying not to take it too personally as the junior minister who brought corporation tax down under George Osborne. I think in the long term, giving up our competitive advantage on corporation tax is quite a move. I think it was politically the easiest way of raising large sums of money, but whether that sends the sort of pro-business open to inward investment message that we want, I would question.
It's a bit early on in the hour for a slightly punchy question, but I can't resist asking you then, if you're not a fan of the corporation tax rise, what would you have done to start to try and bring the deficit down?
A very fair question, because I know from experience it's much easier to be in favour of fiscal responsibility in abstract and not in the specific. I think if you're wanting to raise serious sums of money, you have to use the big levers in the tax system, and that's income tax, national insurance, and VAT. Now, to some extent, they have done that with income tax and freezing the allowances. But I think that the manifesto pledge was a mistake at the time, but in terms of the new circumstances we're in, if we want to raise serious sums of money, we should use those big taxes. In the end, all taxes end up being paid by people. Corporation taxes is just a very good way of disguising that. But I think use the levers that you have with income tax, NICs, and VAT.
Thank you. Anita, over to you. I saw some nodding going on at the early part of what David was saying. You may or may not agree with that last point, though.
So on the early parts, no, I do entirely agree with David that this was a very politically astute budget. And I think it kind of speaks to the reality of politics, which is that, it's cyclical. There are economic cycles and there are political cycles. And politically, it makes much more sense to produce a tougher budget in respect of whether it's cuts in departmental spending or increases in taxes earlier on in the political cycle, which hopefully gives you wriggle room for, a pre-election, whether it's a giveaway or a much more generous settlement. So I think the Chancellor also had to deal with the reality that actually at this stage of the economic cycle, when the economy hasn't quite recovered, that you could risk with big tax rises choking off a recovery. And so I think the Chancellor did very well to kind of introduce politically a discussion about increases in taxes via corporation tax and this rowing back of the kind of the rhythm that George Osborne and David Gauke set in motion around personal allowance rises, that is a kind of really good broad-based tax change, which does make a huge difference to the Treasury's coffers. So I think that it's politically been very astute. But the one thing I would say, though, is that I don't think this was just about planning for pre-election giveaways if needed. I do think that the Chancellor probably has half an eye to what's happening in the US, and the fact that, with a huge stimulus package that might be coming from Joe Biden, inflation, interest rates, like that could be a huge concern for a lot of countries in the Western world. And so he does need a bit of wriggle room for that economic reality. So I would say that it's very much a politically astute budget, but I do think there is more economics in there than some of the coverage might have you believe.
Thank you. Lindsay, one of the things I think we've seen during COVID is that some of the existing inequalities in our society have been exacerbated and possibly some new ones have been created. So this is not a pandemic that has hit everyone equally. How do you feel about the budget in terms of whether or not this is really serious budget about closing those inequalities, or is it actually going to drive them further apart?
Yeah, I think you're spot on in saying that the COVID-19 has really exaggerated some of the structural inequalities. I mean, not least in terms of housing, for example. It's obviously brought housing inequalities very much to the fore as people have spent so much time in their homes, and that has all kinds of echo effects down the generations, and especially for young people who are being homeschooled at the moment. I think what's really interesting is if you look at this financial year, so 2021, in terms of income inequality, it's actually been quite a good year. We've actually seen income inequality close over this year, and that's largely been driven by policy. And of course, it's largely been driven by the JRS and the self-employed income support schemes, and it's also been driven by the £20 uplift in universal credit. So clearly, the Chancellor penciled in yesterday, the day before, the phasing out of the JRS scheme. And I think he did a very sensible job in terms of extending that beyond the point at which social restrictions are expected to be lifted. So it's obviously going in September in full, but he also penciled in the removal of the £20 UC uplift. And those two things taken together will mean that certainly low-income families and those who are more likely to move into unemployment coming into the autumn period will see their incomes fall quite considerably by the end of this year. So that is another driver for income inequality. I mean, I think the kind of longer-term question really around the income inequality is what will happen to young people. So we know that the pandemic has affected young people particularly hard. It's obviously they've got high rates of unemployment. And we also know that unemployment when you're young is very scarring. And so I think there's big open questions about the effectiveness of programs like Kickstart and how, you know, how they really do link people back into the labour market and help them upskill in that process.
Thank you. I want to make sure I bring all the panelists in at least once, but if anyone wants to come back on anything that's been said so far, then please do. But Andrew, if I could just come to you, and you were pretty punchy yesterday around the budget, and particularly around the fact that the Chancellor's vision seemed very centralised, and that, you know, moving people out of London is all very well, but what about powers and what about cash? And, you know, do you think the budget missed an opportunity for a serious statement around levelling up?
Sadly, yes. I mean, in truth, we didn't have a vision for the economy. We had a short-term set of interventions about dealing with recovery and the COVID impact. But beyond that, we didn't hear anything from the Chancellor that really set out a sort of sense as to where the economy is going. And I find it remarkable that if you ignore the next 2 years of economic bounce, which we get, we then revert to growth rates of 1.6, 1.5, which is awful. It's absolutely awful. And there's no sense of how we're going to raise that rate, even back towards 2%, never mind anything else, which means we get 10 years of wage stagnation, which is essentially what we've had. So I think there's a big question there beyond COVID about how do we get our economy growing at somewhere near 2%, and I don't see any answers for that. But specifically on your levelling up question, I think there is a massive missed opportunity. I think despite rhetoric that we hear pretty much every day from ministers, we're still no closer to a strategy for achieving it. We're still no closer to any sense of what it is in the government's mind. We don't really know what levelling it up is. And in reality, over the last 6 months, actually, the position in relation to levelling up, I think, has regressed. It's got further away as an ambition. And that's not just because of the pandemic. And now I think we're in a position where, levelling up constitutes a bunch of ad hoc interventions by the government bestowing gifts on places using questionable criteria to determine which places get those gifts. So whether that's moving government departments around, as you said, whether it's to Wolverhampton or to Darlington or to Leeds with the National Infrastructure Bank, or whether it's giving free port status to places across the country, or introducing another round of small penny packet pots of money that local authorities will have to competitively bid for, but government will ultimately decide whether it's levelling up fund or the towns fund or the community renewal fund. All of that, that's a regression from where we were 12, maybe 18, certainly 24 months ago. So I'm unfortunately, it's a Friday morning, but I'm slightly depressed on this levelling up agenda. My final point would be, unless we grapple with how we get the national economy growing at somewhere around 2%, dealing with levelling up issues is going to be all the more challenging to think about. And what you'll end up doing, which is where we're getting to, is a sort of beggar thy neighbour. All we'll be able to do at best is give one place something at the expense of somewhere else. And that's really not what we should be aiming to do.
Maybe I could ask you to pick up one of the questions that's come in, and thank you to those who've already asked questions. Please do keep them coming, which is around the new super deduction tax relief. And the question asked by the panelists, but I think it's very relevant to what you were just talking about, is do you think the ability, that super deduction will be here to stay, and will it be able to counteract the increase in corporation tax if and when it comes to drive that long-term growth and investment?
Yes, it's a good question. I'd be interested in David's perspective on this, because the OBR modelled out the effect of super deduction, which is a 2-year, and essentially what it does, it pulls investment forward that would have happened anyway into the 2-year period, and then essentially investment rates flatten out to what they previously were. So it's a question there. If we think this is a good thing, which we definitely do, we need to encourage more business investment. That's a given. It's not just about the public sector increasing R&D, it's actually the business community that needs to increase R&D. Then the 2 years is a chance for us to experiment, see what happens. But then if it works, if we do see uplift, then we should be thinking about how that becomes a more permanent part of the investment landscape that we've got. And in fact, in some respects, that would probably be able to compensate for some of the concerns that David's got about corporation tax, which is essentially a tax on profit, not less so on investment.
Yeah, Andrew, I think sets it out well. What the super deduction is likely to do is bring forward some investment. That's what the OBR has modelled, rather than necessarily creating any new investment in aggregate. I have to say, I think there's going to be a huge amount of dead weight cost to this. So if you're British Telecom, this is fabulous news, because you're going to be spending a lot of money on full fibre rollout in those 2 years, and now you're getting this super deduction. So that's great news, but it's not actually going to change behaviour, which was the intention. I think it'll bring some things forward. But I suspect the government will look at this. I've heard a couple of people say, you know what, I don't think they're going to raise this corporation tax rate to 25%. They'll find a way of not doing it in the end. I don't agree with that. I think what they might do, if they're under pressure, is extend the super deduction, and they'll see what happens over the next couple of years. My personal view is as I think that this is quite a big departure from the approach that we've had, as I was saying earlier, since Nigel Lawson, broad-based low rates. I think it can have some, it could work, but I worry it might have some unfortunate distortive effects that in fact it might encourage some really quite bad investment, because it's not just about the quantity of investment you have, it's also the quality. You might find people making investment decisions that actually aren't really justified, so it can result in some inefficiency. But to answer the question, could I see this becoming permanent? Yes, I think there is a very good chance that if the Chancellor is under attack for business investment, that the performance is poor, which I fear it may well be, and indeed the OBR projects that it will be, then one obvious lever would be to extend it. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen.
Thanks,
Melanie, can I quickly come back on Andrew's points about levelling up and the kind of big economic vision? And so, full disclaimer, former Conservative special advisor here, will naturally be sympathetic to the government's position. I would just say two things. On the point about levelling up, I guess my point is fundamentally, there is no government in history that disagrees with the idea of investment in the North and in the Midlands, etc. And I think it's been a constant rhetorical refrain in different language over the past 20 years, arguably 30. And so I think that actually what's needed for levelling up is not, here is a grand big vision with all these little things attached to it. It is actually just very bread and butter, incremental investment in places outside of London and the southeast. And so I think I'm less cynical about what levelling up is, because although we talk about it and say all the government talks about is levelling up, we're very much in the political and Westminster bubble. I think what people will experience outside of this bubble is just like, oh, okay, my town centre got a new, got better roads, or, oh, there's been some additional investment in a kind of 5G hub that's happening in my town centre. And I kind of think that stuff is the stuff that makes more of a difference than some kind of, big bang plan for this that's going to revolutionise everything that happens outside of London and the southeast. Quickly on the second point about there being a lack of vision in this budget, I kind of think we're halfway through an incredibly difficult crisis point, and we don't yet know. I mean, we're optimistic that actually this will all be over by the summer, but variants, etc., can throw that off. And the reality is that the way that we live and work has changed radically through this pandemic, and we're not yet sure which things are going to be permanent and which things are going to completely rebound, whether that's flexible working. Ultimately, people might want it, but will businesses think it's sensible? Are we going to see a huge acceleration of, the kinds of moves you've seen around housing? Are people going to centre themselves away from city centres? Are we going to see a huge residential influx into city centres? Is the online acceleration going to continue to go gangbusters? Will high streets completely transform? I kind of think it feels to me as though it's quite soon for the Chancellor to be predicting those outcomes and deciding which ones he wants to back and which ones he wants to change.
Thank you. Adam, I think this is the longest I've ever shared a platform with a virtual reel with you and not giving you the chance to come in and get a word in. So now is your moment. And I'm going to pick up another question from our audience, which is, I think, particularly appropriate to you, given JLL's track record on sustainability and the fact that, being parochial for a moment, our Vice President, Guy Granger, has a global leadership role on sustainability for JLL. So the question is, well, it was disappointing to see business rates kick further into the long grass, and we might come back to that if there's time a little bit later on. Do you agree that the most disappointing aspect, particularly as we host COP26, was to fail to introduce true sustainability policy incentives and taxes?
I mean, there's a very short answer, which is, of course, absolutely yes. I think the big miss, the really big miss in the budget was not to set out some architecture around the vision for innovation in this country. It links a lot of the comments that have already been set out. This was a budget that was about stabilizing the ship and putting holes in the dam of public finances. But it was also an opportunity. I don't accept this view that you had to do one and then the other. There is absolutely an opportunity to build the architecture for that vision about UK PLC and its innovation plans going forward. The innovation fund is encouraging. 15 billion pounds is no small sum. But Germany did not all that far off that number last year. Sweden did something close to 5 billion USD last year. We're already playing catch up, and I think the big miss that I find difficult, particularly from my perspective, monitoring capital flows in real estate and how it relates to sustainable investment right across the planet, is you can see this enormous shift in capital and private sector appetite to engage with the green revolution, to engage with innovation, and not to set out the architecture that allows us to think more concretely as UK PLC about the ways we can invest in that future. For me, feels a real indictment, a real miss. You think about the 5% of buildings that need to be retrofit every single year in order to meet those carbon reduction commitments by 2050. We haven't really got to the starting point yet, and yet some of our near competitors now in nationalistic terms are moving ahead of us. The vision for me has been sitting, if you like, in the background for far too long, and real estate investors, UK PLC more generally, has got a lot of opportunity, a lot of will to engage in this space, and even private households who could do so much more with that enormous, at least short-term blip in the savings rate. If we pivot that savings into really simple solutions around energy performance investment, loft insulation, all of that good stuff, you're channeling capital, private capital, sitting off the public finances, off the balance sheet. You're channeling it towards your long-term vision. But without a vision, folk are going to do other things with their money, and that for me is the real miss.
Thanks. Lindsay, I see you nodding along with that. Would you like to make a comment here, particularly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's worth connecting the two dots that Adam just brought up, which is the savings rate, the aggregate savings rate, which obviously also went through the roof last year, and lots of people did bank a lot of money last year, and big questions about what they're going to do with that. And I suppose I was thinking more about the sort of micro level. I mean, obviously last summer in the budget, the Chancellor announced a Green Homes Grant. And there's been a lot in the press and recently about how dismal the performance of that has been. And I think it was a real missed opportunity yesterday not to revisit that and not to be thinking about how to kickstart that and get it going and address the problems. I mean, to go back to the savings rate point, I mean, there was a really interesting chart in the Bank of England's NMG survey recently that asked people what are they going to do with their savings that they banked over the pandemic period. And the vast majority of people say they're going to keep it in a bank account. But the second most common answer was, I'm either going to put it towards a deposit for a home or I'm going to do home improvements. So I think it's absolutely right that there is a way of leveraging that for kind of good green outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. Let's move on and talk a little bit more specifically about property and real estate, and pick up a couple more of the questions that have been asked. And David, I'm going to come back to you first. as the national politician on the panel. I was going to ask the question one way. It's been asked in a different way on our Q&A function. So my question was going to be, why is it apparently politically unacceptable to support real estate? The question from the floor was, this was a budget that did nothing for us really. Is it because we're not liked, because we're fat cats who have enough money, or because we're not the priority? And that's the way, I guess that's the way that most people on this call will feel in terms of how the government views our industry. So why is it apparently politically unacceptable to support the real estate industry?
Yeah, a lot of this is politics, and please don't shoot the messenger here in terms of how the sector is viewed. But first of all, there is always a political bias, if you like, to lots of people versus fewer people, and there is always a sort of political pressure in terms of those who are sort of seen as the underdogs versus the overdogs, as it were. But so there tends to be sympathy more for the tenant versus the landlord. There tends to be a view that large businesses can look after themselves. Politics tends to respond to people, and I mean it's a little bit like the corporation tax debate, in the sense that you will have noticed that there's a sort of the small profits rate has been brought back, and so corporation tax hasn't been increased on those small businesses versus a big increase on the large businesses, because that's politically easier to do. It's in the case of the small profits rate, it's a really bad policy, but for lots of reasons. But it's responding to that. I think there is also sometimes a perception of the property market, if you like, and again, stress, please don't shoot the messenger, but the people who create things, who do things, who are sort of adding value, who make things, they're the people we want to support. Property is just, well, it's just kind of there and benefiting from the economic rent and so on. And however much that might be an unsophisticated view, politics can be quite unsophisticated. And the point also made about priorities always exist in politics, and if you're going to help somebody, who you can't help everybody, and you end up picking and choosing. And if you think you can get away with not helping somebody, because there are plenty of people where you can't get away with failing to help them, then that's what happens. And that's the really sort of unfortunate thing about it. And I suppose the question for the property industry is how to change that, and how to have and I know the BPF works very hard at doing this, of how do you get a narrative of saying, well, look, if you can make our sector work properly, then this has huge benefits for wider society, and trying to find a way of conveying that is the challenge.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, can I just add a thought? And again, in the spirit of, as David said, this is what I hear a lot. Whether I agree with it or not is a different point. But I hear a lot when you go to places. I mean, I'm picking up on something that Anita said earlier on. You go to lots of places, Blackburn, Burnley, Grimsby, those places that are struggling, particularly their high streets and their town centres and their city centres are struggling. You will hear a common complaint, which is that property owners or landlords are not doing their fair share. In a sense, they're an obstacle to the recovery of this town centre because they're not willing to be more flexible or to lower their rents or whatever it may. Now, again, all I'm doing at this point is just kind of offering out a view that I hear a lot in different places about the problem that the property industry presents to places that want to re-engineer or reimagine their place. As I said, we can debate the merits of that view, but that is a widely held view, and that is most definitely shared with local MPs, because not least local MPs are often those that are, sharing that view, and that trickles upwards, as David said, into national politicians then when they think about, big ticket things that are done at the budget.
Can I just come back on that? And I think Andrew raises a really important point. And when I said earlier that to the extent the sector can try to communicate what it can do more widely, this issue of high streets. I know that everybody watching this is well aware of it, but the issue of high streets is going to be hugely important in the next few years politically. Because the Conservatives won a lot of seats, partly on a message of we will revive your high street, and then we walk into this pandemic that all other things equal, it's going to be really, really damaging for the traditional high street. And so this is something I'm sure the government is going to prioritise over the years ahead. I know, putting my McFarlane's hat on, we're giving a lot of thought as to what could be done in terms of helping the high streets, and I know that the BPF are doing a huge amount of work on this as well. And I think to the extent that the sector can come forward with a set of proposals, a plan, this is what we can do to help the high street that is realistic, that isn't about going back to the high streets of our childhoods, but recognizing the way that consumer behavior has changed, and that high streets are going to have to adapt. But finding a way of communicating that, I think, is, at one level it's a huge threat, as Andrew says, because the danger is the property sector get the blame. But I think it is also an opportunity to say, look, property matters. If we get this right, let's work with government and find a way in which the high streets can be revived, reformed, and made successors for the 2020s.
Melanie, if I could just come in on that, because I think David is, of course, absolutely right. What's important here is to appreciate as well that the UK has the strongest online adoption from a retail standpoint of anywhere on the planet as a result of last year, when we were already level pegging with one or two other countries, and we're now, if you like, the leading online adopter, which means we're not going to find our solutions elsewhere. We need to demonstrate a lot more leadership, homegrown leadership, to solve these sort of challenges. And you can see the issues that are bubbling up, of course, with large online organizations elsewhere, and how governments are trying to tackle it. We haven't seen enough, I think, from our own government on how we're going to find a balance. And this isn't about, of course, as David rightly says, constraining the tide of consumer behavior. It's about enabling it, but of course, recognizing it needs to sit within the context of hybrid formats and high street rejuvenation. And I see it as a big opportunity for government as well, to be candid, because you've got a heck of a lot more people that are rediscovering local towns, local shops, local services. And in order to underpin that new behavior change with something that is more permanent, that is something that is a structural shift, needs some considered efforts. And Andrew made the point earlier, which I wholly support, that sprinkling some fairy dust of money around countries, or around towns with perhaps nowhere near enough real vision about how those investments come together, I think falls short of what the UK will require ultimately to be resilient and to protect and support our high streets going forward.
Thanks, Adam. Anita, so we've heard some uncomfortable truths that we absolutely need to hear as an industry. We spend too much time talking amongst ourselves and not enough time possibly listening, to standing back and hearing what others think of us. But you're a local councillor, so what does local government feel of us? Are we just as I'm not sure what the word is really, but do local government have the same view that David was describing in terms of national government, or particularly maybe in the context of this town centres?
I don't know if it's just me or if Melanie is frozen for everyone.
I think she has just frozen, but it sounded to me like a local authority response to what is a national challenge, if you want to come in, Anita.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And the funny thing is, I'm a councillor in London, in Redbridge, wonderful part of London, do come there. And I think that it does. I think the experience of local councils outside of London and outside of city centres is markedly different, to be honest. And I think that commercial property, this sector, is kind of integral to the way that local government operates in those busy town centres, in contrast to some of the town centres where the government is investing, like Yarmouth. I think they have a very different relationship to the industry in somewhere that's a former seaside town. So I think that it really does depend on the specifics. I think it's going to be very interesting moving forward. I think everyone's spoken to the reality of the dynamism that we're going to see in high streets, both in terms of big established retailers that are going to either decide they can't survive on the high street or to adopt a radically different model. And so I kind of think it might be slightly too soon, but I think if the industry can position itself as wanting to help support what a local government council will have as its vision for a town centre, I think that's a route to a very constructive engagement and a very constructive relationship, in contrast to national government, where it's difficult for them to have one view of the entire picture.
Thank you. And the moratoriums, one of the dogs that didn't bark in the budget on Wednesday. No indication that the Chancellor was going to do a U-turn and not bring them to an end as planned and already announced at the end of March. Should we take comfort from that, or do you think that's just another kick coming property's way in the next few days?
In the next few days? I mean, let's see. I genuinely don't know at this point. Yeah, I think predictions are a bit of not my game. I don't know if David wants to say more.
Thank you, Anita. No, hard to say. I mean, I think a lot of this, in terms of what is going to happen in the short term, we have to remember the most important thing is going to be the virus and the battle against the virus, and that's the most important economic policy at the moment is the rollout of the vaccine, and it's always worth bearing that in mind in terms of judgments. But yeah, I think in the short term they made all their big announcements in the budget, and I think that's probably it for the time being, would be my guess.
Yeah, I might exercise chair's privilege and offer an answer to that question too, which is I don't think you should assume from the fact that there wasn't an announcement about the moratoriums in the budget that that indicates a definite decision that the moratoriums are going to expire as planned. And I think you might well expect to hear something more on that in the next few days, would be my own prediction. But there we go. Lindsay, let me come back to you. So we're on the subject broadly of town centres, and I will come back to the business rates question that Jerry's picked up as well from Hamilton. If you want to comment on that, then please do. But what do you think is key to the recovery of town and city centres? And do you think that that our role in that is well understood generally?
I think it's interesting when we've looked at our work and we've looked at the labour market hit geographically, that the two things we've observed is obviously the sort of exodus from city centres, but also the exodus from areas which are kind of tourism hotspots. So coastal towns in particular have been really hard hit. And I think it's legitimate to think that those coastal towns will have a regeneration, and the city centres perhaps less so. So I suppose the big sort of question around the levelling up agenda for us is, what do you want to take jobs to people, or do you want to bring people to jobs? And so I think there's a kind of really significant and unanswered question there. And the other thing someone else alluded to earlier on is I think it's Anita about patterns of mobility and the extent to which our tastes and our preferences are going to be fundamentally changed by the pandemic. And I suspect that that's a rather elite debate fundamentally. I mean, you think about people who live in social housing, they don't have the option to up sticks and move. So there are large parts of our population and our workforce who are static and who are not going to have the kind of luxury of relocating to an area that's either more attractive and suits their personal tastes, or is where the jobs are moving to. So fundamentally, we've got to think about the people who are much more static and think about what we do in terms of economic development for them too.
I would agree with that. If I can jump in, Melanie, I mean, I would. Again, this is the caricature, and there's lots more variation and nuance. But we're on a panel, and we've only got an hour. So a lot of the debate on the future town centres is, and the solutions are all on the supply side, right? They're all, we need to reformulate the property, we need to vary the mixes, and all of that, all of which we're going to need to do. But the fundamental reality, and this squarely sits in Lindsay's area, is that when you go to many places, Burnley, Blackburn, Grimsby, I'll use those examples again, Hull, the fundamental problem is that there's not enough aggregate demand in the economy, right? People don't have enough money in their pocket to spend money on the high street. And that's because for 12 years, we have had awful wage growth, right? I mean, particularly at the lower end of the income distribution, we are struggling to create jobs and economic opportunity, but puts money in their pocket. And when money's in their pocket, they go and spend it. Yes, they spend a bit more online, but they still spend an awful lot in streets in the physical world. So we've got to think about those questions and issues about how we drive up aggregate demand. And that talks about skills and investment. It doesn't talk about high street reformulation, although that is part and parcel of what it is. But we've got to connect these kind of things together. You see this quite clearly in the data. The best high streets are the most prosperous high streets. The best high streets sit in the most prosperous town centres or towns and city centres, and so on. You know, we don't see vibrant, prosperous high streets surrounded by poor areas. That is not the way this works, right? Prosperous areas drive prosperous high streets. Very simple, but so we need more prosperous places.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, let's stick with that theme of sort of investment, economic stimulus, and productivity and growth. And stick with you just for a minute, Andrew, and pick up one of the other questions from our audience. How significant for real estate is, or indeed generally, is the abolition of the industrial strategy? The questioner asks, is this simply short-sighted London-centric behaviour that fails to understand the import of manufacturing and the like for CRE? But answer that specifically, but broaden that out to talk about, you know, whether the abolition of the industrial strategy, in your view, is significant or not.
Well, and I take on board, you know, Nita's point. It's very difficult. And if you looked at the reasons why the Secretary of State gave for the abolishment of the strategy and indeed the council, it was at deeply uncertain times. Things have changed. Industrial strategy is not a brand that we wish to continue on, all of which, you know, is neither here nor there in some respects. I think it's concerning, at least, I think, that the government is now pausing and probably going to rethink fairly fundamental issues that haven't really been changed by COVID. And if you look at what the industrial strategy, be all the froth, was trying to do, is trying to improve our skills base in this country. That's a problem that COVID has not changed at all. It's trying to improve the geographic distribution of economic activity, particularly at the high end of the economy. COVID has done nothing to knock that off. In fact, it's exacerbated that. It's trying to improve rates of business investment alongside public investment in R&D. Both of those things were pre-COVID. So the fundamentals are still there, whether you call it an industrial strategy or not. You know, I'm less concerned about. But so I think if those fundamentals are still to be adhered to in the plan for growth or whatever it is called, then that will give me some comfort. But it's questionable. A lot of this is symbolic, and it does send signals about what's important and what isn't.
David, I'm going to come to you and pick up another question from the floor on a similar theme. So does the panel think, do you think we should see more encouragement to invest in real estate and infrastructure projects from the private sector? If so, has the budget missed an opportunity to review how we do that, such as new thinking for enterprise zones, perhaps building on the Freeport's thinking, and new funding structures that offer tax advantages to investors?
Well, I think that it comes back a little bit to how you want to use the tax system and the extent to which you try to incentivize particular behaviors, or whether you just try to provide perhaps a simpler tax system that is nonetheless encouraging enterprise, encouraging investment, and so on. And my personal view is that there can be an over-reliance on using the tax system to motivate particular activity in particular areas. I'm quite a Lawsonian in that sense. And I slightly worry that we're going a little bit too far in the direction. I mean, this builds on some of the points that Andrew made earlier, of displacing activity, picking a little area and then let's move stuff there. It comes back to the sort of whole free ports debate. Are we going to end up just displacing activity from one place to another? You can make arguments about clustering effects, but the economic evidence isn't terribly convincing about all of that. So yes, of course, we want an environment where which is good for investment. We do need to improve our infrastructure. We do need to think about levelling up. But I mean, if I want to be kind of critical, I fear that levelling up is a slogan still in search of a strategy or even some policies. And I think if we want to find a way in which we can improve our physical infrastructure, improve our sort of real estate, I'm a little skeptical. I mean, I think one has to look at all the options, but I'm a little skeptical of an approach which is too much, this town gets the benefit of these incentives, this town gets these incentives, and let's see what happens. I just fear you end up with more complexity and a lot of displacement and not really improving our overall economic position.
Thank you. While you've got the microphone, I'll pick up another question from the floor. I won't read it in full, but the question at the end of the comment is, how, and this will be music to your ears, how can the case for low corporation tax rates be made, and who should be making it?
Yeah, I saw that question, and I think making the point as well, and I must be careful not to go off on one here, but no wonder business investment hasn't grown in recent years since the Brexit vote, I think was the essence of the comment, to which I would be inclined to agree. And who should make the case for low corporation tax rates? Well, I've sort of felt a sort of somewhat lonely task falling on my shoulders in the last few days. But look, I do think there is a case, given time, that a low corporation tax rate will help business investment. The challenge for anyone making that case is that when you say let's have low corporation tax rates, most people think, oh, so it's fat cat businesses, they're doing very nicely, thank you very much, that's good, how does that help me? And trying to make the argument that in fact all taxes are paid by people in the end. We have to tax, and we're going to have to increase taxes, in my view, because the demands on public spending are so strong. But we should look to do that in a way that is least damaging for our capacity for economic growth, and that people think that corporation tax is particularly progressive. There's no real evidence to support that. The consequences of corporation tax, where it is ultimately paid, is really, really hard to judge. But we know that all tax is paid by people. Is it going to be workers in terms of reduced investment, therefore reduced wages in the long run? Is it going to be consumers? Is it going to be shareholders and our pension funds and so on? I think it's a complicated one. It's a difficult argument to win, but if you want us to be particularly attracting that foreign inward investment, I do think it's one of the levers. It's not the most important lever, I wouldn't argue that, but it is one of the levers that a government can pull to bring that investment in our direction.
Thanks, David. And I'm going to come back to you next and try and wrap up two questions from the floor. There's sort of a quite specific one and a very broad one, and I'll bring others in on the very broad one. So the specific question is around business rates. And again, I won't read it in full, but the gist of the question is that the Chancellor hasn't done enough in giving further business rates relief to non-essential retail, leisure and hospitality, given that they're not even open yet and will certainly not be fully trading and for some time to come. So the specific question is around business rates and whether the Chancellor should have done more. And the broad question that sort of helicopters out from that is, Is it not the case that we still have a tax system that's in need of radical overhaul in a number of places to better support business and individuals in the post-pandemic economy and promote growth?
So on business rates, I mean, I don't know whether we're going to hear something on the 23rd of March, tax day, whether we'll hear something on that, but generally they've been saying they've put the review off until the autumn. Obviously, we've seen the short-term extension of the business rates holiday, but there is very considerable political pressure to do something about it. Can I just make, again, don't shoot the messenger, but can I just make a point on business rates, that one of the things that Treasury ministers will be getting as the advice from officials, and this advice is consistent with what the IFS says, is that in the long run, if you cut business rates, the benefit will go to the landlord, not the tenant. Now, yeah, there might be plenty of support for that amongst this audience, but the economic, the people who complain about business rates are the people who pay for it directly. But actually, if business rates go down, the Treasury worries that rents will go up, and that the people who have complained won't see any benefit from the tax cut. And given that business rates brings in a lot of money, that's an issue. Now, to be fair, I've never heard a business accept that argument, but economists tend to make that. And that's one of the reasons why business rates have not been cut as aggressively as a lot of people have called for in recent years.
Thank you. Adam, can I come to you on this, maybe on the broader question of the tax system and whether it's fit for purpose in the 21st century?
Yeah, there are certainly others better qualified to talk about a complete renaturing or overhaul of a tax system than I. But I'm certainly not a fan of major change, particularly of the complexity that sort of approach would imply. And quite simply, particularly if I wear some of my old hat as a residential analyst and researcher, one absolute certainty is that temporary policy changes have a high likelihood of being long-term policy changes, but equally in housing, and we've seen it elsewhere, temporary tinkering also becomes a constant. And I'm a much stronger fan of being able to create greater stability, greater clarity, allowing businesses to plan, to adjust, and markets to plan and to adjust accordingly. And that, the dynamic that David was describing with business rates specifically is, of course, a dynamic that is played out in market terms. And this is currently a market where you're not going to see high street rents ratcheting up overnight as a result of a reduction in business rates, because frankly, there isn't a market that can absorb that kind of change. But what we are talking about is renaturing that balance so that it is more appropriate, in line with a modern economy that has a blend of online as well as physical footprint in a high street sense. For me, it's about making sure that some of those changes that are coming through have clear forward guidance. We have clear visibility from a business planning perspective. And it goes right back to the first comment I was making. I want to see a clear vision for this country and for the fiscal structure that underpins UK PLC, and then let UK PLC do what it does so well, which is to innovate, to invest appropriately, and to create some of that fundamental leveling up that is not around cherry picking towns and cities. It's about creating a rising tide. I know that sounds a little bit sweeping and high-minded, but you did offer that it was a helicopter question, so I'm giving you a bit of a helicopter answer.
Melanie, can I come in very quickly on this question? I think she's frozen, so oh no.
I'm back, just back in the room. Lindsay, can I come to you on this question of the tax system, and could you also pick up one of the questions asked from the floor around housing, which you may or may not want to link the two things together, but in terms of the massive housing shortage, no support is provided by government to encourage this. I'm not sure I quite agree with that assertion. as broadly as that, but does the government do enough, and is reform of the tax system part of the answer to that and to some of the other challenges we've been talking about?
Yeah, let me try and bring those threads together. I think, clearly, if we're talking about residential, clearly private developers retrench in periods when they're concerned about house prices. So, that there's, obvious reasons why they're not building out at the same levels now, not least, of course, that the practical problems of getting people on site. But I was actually quite surprised in the budget. Adam just mentioned tinkering. I think there was a lot of tinkering on the kind of residential housing side in the budget. But I was quite surprised about the two interventions from the Chancellor in terms of the stamp duty extension and also the mortgage support guarantee that he introduced for people who need kind of larger mortgages. In that they're both very much sort of potentially inflationary policies in terms of house prices. So there seems to be quite a kind of appetite for keeping house prices at a reasonably high level. And I think that's probably partly because they want to stimulate builders and they want to get builders back out on site and they want to get private builders churning out to try and hit their magical 300,000 target a year. And I think that's important. But if you think about the sort of two other parts of housing supply, there's obviously questions about whether they could have done more on the affordable homes programme to stimulate housing associations and local authorities to build. And that, of course, is really important during a recessionary period because it's counter-cyclical, so you can keep that going. So I think there's a sort of slight missed opportunity there. To bring it back to the tax point, I suppose the one thing that's been hovering around for many, many years, certainly as long as I've ever worked on housing, has been the question about what the government should do on the build to rent sector and on the professionalising of the private rented sector. And there's obviously been a kind of really mixed bag of messages to the build to rent sector over the last sort of 10 years or so. There's been some encouragement, there's been some sort of efforts to try and introduce planning channels that are faster, but then there's been a kind of sort of rebuff with the stamp duty surcharges. And I think that fundamentally the government remains very, very wedded to commit to a kind of policy around home ownership. And what it hasn't done is really get its head around what happens around the private rented sector. And what does that, how do you deal with the fact that there are lots and lots of families in the UK now who will never become homeowners because it's either too expensive or they've missed their chance generationally, and who probably will remain in the private rent sector for the rest of their life? And how do you make those homes fit for purpose and secure and attractive? And I think that they haven't got to grips with that yet, and that remains a big, big question.
Thank you. Anita, I'm going to come to you, if I may, for the last question from the floor. Do you expect higher commercial property taxation in the next budget? Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very good question, and I definitely think that what the Chancellor has done is essentially get away with flagging up broad-based tax increases. So I definitely think it's not beyond the realms of possibility that he thinks he can get away with that again, particularly in a sector, as David says, that doesn't have a particularly emotional argument for reasons why it would be politically challenging. So I think there are kind of the business reality and the economic reality and the political reality of how that would land. And I would suggest there are sectors where you'd have a lot of people up in arms. This may not be one of them. And so I think it's down to people on this call to make the case and make a strong political case for not seeing that change. And I guess to wrap up, I'd say that in a way we've come full circle. At the beginning, Melanie, you asked kind of, was this a conservative budget? And I guess my take is that a conservative budget is one that doesn't that gives you enough wriggle room politically to do what you need to do to govern well and win a next election. And I think that a lot of the conversation we've had around what we'd ideally like to see regarding tax, I'm surprised there hasn't been more discussion, for instance, of stamp duty and why it exists and all that, is that the reality of governing is very much what are the politically sellable things that you can do, and so I think that actually in that reality, I think this has been a reasonable budget considering that constraint.
Thank you, Andrew. You have 30 seconds to comment on that, or give me. Is your nod a comment enough?
My nod is a comment enough. Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you very much to all of my panelists. That's been a fantastic and fascinating hour for me, and I hope for everyone who's been listening too. Thank you all so much for joining us. I think you will be able to listen to this again. if not today, in a few days' time. So enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy what I hope will be a sunny weekend. And thank you to all of you for joining us. And again, to my fantastic panel. Thank you all very much indeed.